second half of our interview coming up today with Mike Wood, a historian and writer for Police One, talking about the war on cops.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, Chuck Holton here. This is the second half of our interview with Mike Wood, and it's really powerful. You need to go back and watch the first half as well. But we're talking specifically about just what the police are facing today and what it's going to take to actually put a stop to this violence. And as a bonus, we're going to talk a little bit about the upcoming election and what might happen there. So check it out.
You know, we have other options to exhaust before we start talking about an activation of the Insurrection Act, right?
So like what?
Well, for instance, we have a significant capability with the National Guard that we can use to augment our local police forces. One of the problems that you see that's cropping up in a place like Portland right now is that you're seeing a breakdown of the mutual aid pacts that law enforcement agencies rely upon. And for those that may not be familiar, law enforcement agencies throughout the United States have agreements with neighboring jurisdictions that if they have some kind of emergency situation, whether it's an earthquake, a flood, a fire, a riot, whatever, if they have some kind of emergency situation that's beyond the capability of them to handle by themselves, then they will rely upon their neighbors to come and support and provide troops and assistance and logistical assistance and physical labor to deal with the emergency. And we've seen that used in things like domestic terror attacks in the United States. You know, in the last several years, we've seen it used in California wildfires that are raging and floods and hurricanes. And we've also seen it used during these violent protests and riots. And what unfortunately is happening in places like Portland is because of the political climate there, where a district attorney of I believe it's Multnomah County, which is the county that Portland is part of, the district attorney there has decided not to prosecute any of these violent criminals for their crimes. And so as a result, the sheriffs of the neighboring counties who have been asked to come and support the Portland Police Bureau in their efforts to fight these rioters, they're not willing to commit their troops because they don't want their troops to be injured for the purpose of enforcing these laws if the laws are not actually going to be enforced by the district attorney. If the criminals won't be prosecuted, the sheriffs don't want to risk their men and women, their most precious resource. And so what we have in a place like Portland right now is where we have the chief of police of Portland Police Bureau asking for help from neighboring agencies, and they're refusing to give it because of the political situation there. So it's a very dangerous situation. And so that leaves the locals with very few options. And right now, one of the options that's being exercised is to bring in the Oregon State Police, which are under the command of the governor, and the governor can direct them to appear. They don't have the discretion that some of the local agencies do to opt out. And so the governor has asked the state police to participate. And so they're supporting the Portland Police Bureau right now in their riot preparations.
But what's the point if they're not going to charge these people with anything? If they literally are arresting people, taking them to jail, and then immediately letting them go without even bail in many cases, what's the point? Or why are they even bothering to expend the resources? Why not just keep the cops at home?
Well, that's the $1 million question, Chuck. Why are we going to put these officers out there night after night to take the rocks, to take the bottles, to take the explosives that are being thrown at them? Mm-hmm. Why are we doing that? And that's the $1 million question. And I think what we're seeing in Portland is we're seeing a meltdown of the system. We're seeing a true crisis in government and in civic leadership there.
Well, that's no doubt at all. I mean, when the police commissioner, Ted Wheeler, the mayor, is literally joining with the rioters in watching, watching them commit felonies all around him, and he's supporting them in that. It's sort of it's a backward circle of life.
Yeah, and
The
that's
circle to
the
death.
interesting twist that differentiates what we're going through now, I think, with what we saw in the late 60s and early 70s. In the prior period, there was a default position from civic leaders that they would support law and order, that they didn't want the destruction of their own communities, and that they would take the actions necessary to prevent that. But we're not seeing that now. What we're seeing in this current cycle is we're seeing that civic leaders are abdicating their responsibility to their citizens, and they're actively supporting these types of violent activities, and they're assisting and abetting and aiding the radicals that are going out and destroying their own communities. And
Wow.
so we have people in places like Portland, we have people in places like Seattle, where they're good people, good citizens that have essentially become trapped behind enemy lines. And they no longer have the support and the protection of the police. And so the fundamental contract between the government and its citizens is being broken. And when we talk about that fundamental contract being broken, that leads us into some very, very dark areas. And it also leads us into some other periods of our American history that we may see come around again in one form or another. So we need to be very, very careful about what we're doing here. And it's very difficult for more rational and more sane heads to prevail in some of these cities where the leadership has just gone full tilt crazy.
Yeah,
And
well, I mean, they're just not willing to use righteous force anymore, and the criminals know it. So they know that these guys are not going to use lethal force against them. When I was in Portland, it was abundantly clear to me that these rioters are a bunch of skinny little pit punks that they're out having fun. This is like paintball for them. It's sport. They're not worried about the tear gas because mommy bought them a gas mask. They're not worried about the pepper balls because mommy bought them body armor, and they are just out there. It's fun. It's something fun to do every night, to go downtown. They could care less. They chant Black Lives Matter. They could care less. 98% of the people down there were white. They could care less, and it's easy to see by their actions. So now we're seeing President Trump deputize troops federally. I say troops, police officers, state police specifically, in places like Portland. Tell me what that does. What options does that give the law enforcement that they didn't have before?
what it does is it opens up a new pipeline for prosecution. When a police officer in the city of Portland arrests a protester who has become a rioter for violent crimes, those crimes are prosecuted by the district attorney of the county. And as we've discussed, the district attorney in Multnomah County there has elected not to prosecute these crimes and has given these criminals a free pass to go and conduct their violence. And so now when you have an organization like the Oregon State Police, which has received selected individuals of the Oregon State Police, selected troopers, have been deputized by the U.S. Marshal Service and given some federal authority. What that allows is it allows the people that are arrested by those Oregon State troopers to now be prosecuted through federal channels. And so now the decision as to whether or not an individual will be prosecuted for these crimes is in the hands of a federal system. And that independent system we have seen in the recent months has not shied away from prosecuting individuals for these types of crimes. Under Attorney General Barr's leadership, we've seen the local federal prosecutors pursue aggressively charges against those people that have attacked federal officers and have tried to burn federal buildings. And so now when we have the Oregon State Police acting under the color of federal authority, it allows them to go ahead and prosecute those individuals through that separate pipeline.
So now little 22-year-old Brittany, who thought it was fun to go LARPing downtown Portland, is all of a sudden looking at 5 to 10 And that probably is going to actually function as a deterrent, which is what law enforcement is supposed to be about.
Yeah, that's the objective, right? And
Yeah.
so now you don't have people that are violent criminals with guns being released by the local district attorney. Now you throw them in the hotel gray bar for 5 or 10 years, and we hopefully discourage this type of action from others.
What do you see happening as we near this election? I mean, now we're seeing these kinds of riots in 48 out of the 50 largest cities in America. I don't know which are the two cities that are not seeing it, but when I was in Lafayette, Louisiana, the other last week, I talked to the mayor there, and they had people try to start riots, and the police put them down immediately because the city leadership was behind the police, stood behind the police, and so those things didn't go anywhere. And even though they had some external agitators and that sort of thing. So what do you see happening between now and November?
Well, I have no doubt that we're going to see an increase in political violence. And as a historian, I think that oftentimes the best metric for what we can expect in the future is to look backwards and see what's happened in similar circumstances. And so I'm fond recently of telling people that I think we're approaching about the year 1968 in our history right now. When we look back to 1968, we had a dramatic surge in political violence in America. The Democratic Convention in Chicago was one massive riot. We had the political assassinations of Robert Kennedy and of Dr. King, which in the case of Dr. King set off riots in 168 major urban areas throughout the United States in 1 week. So we've seen, in the past, bombings, political assassinations, warfare in the streets, and active attempts to have insurrectionists take control of the United States government. We had groups like the Weather Underground Organization that bombed the Pentagon, bombed the White House, bombed New York Police headquarters, bombed police stations in San Francisco. We had groups like the Black Liberation Army that assassinated police officers in cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, coast to coast. So we're going to see an increase in this type of violence, I think, as November nears.
So what did it take at that time to put a stop to it? What was the solution back then that fixed the problem?
It took two things that right now we're not sure if we have in our current situation in America. The first is it took the will to aggressively go after these people and to destroy their organizations. It took active efforts from police agencies to arrest people, active efforts from the legal system to prosecute those people and put them behind bars. It took active efforts from the intelligence community to try to destroy and disrupt the activities of these organizations. So that will right now is in question in our country. There are certainly areas in our society where there are people who are pro-law enforcement and pro-law and order who would support those types of things, but we also have a very active dissident population that is opposed to that. So the first question is, do we have the will to aggressively go after these people with our law enforcement channels? And then the second thing is that these groups and these organizations, they kind of petered out because they wanted to create the chaos and the violence and the unrest that would usher in a communist revolution. And what they found is that the vast majority of America simply wasn't interested in that. They went out and they created the unrest, they created the chaos, they created the violence, and they lit that spark, but the gunpowder never burned. And I think right now we're a very different society in America. What we have is we have a populace that over the last 50 years has been indoctrinated in things like social justice theory, critical race and gender theory, in communist theory, socialist principles. They've been indoctrinated through popular media. They've been indoctrinated through the progressive takeover of the education system. And so what we now have is we have a populace that is less capable of resisting those types of ideas that perhaps is more supportive of some of those theories and some of those ideas. And so you have a more willing populace that is willing to accept the message that these radicals have. And so that leaves us in a very precarious situation where essentially you have a divided America where there is two different opposing philosophies at play. And our system is based on an assumption that we all hold certain core truths to be self-evident, and that we all agree to certain fundamental principles. That's what a republic is. We're a constitutional republic, not a democracy, for the very reason that our system is designed so that everybody believes in a certain bedrock principle, and that's enshrined in our Constitution. And then at that point, we can have discussions about how we are going to institute those bedrock principles, but there's always an understanding that we believe in those things. Simple things like the rule of law. And right now we have a divided America where there's no longer that fundamental agreement in those core principles.
And so we're starting to resemble that married couple that a lot of people know that they have not been married in spirit for a long time, and they're still living together, but they're not fooling anybody.
Absolutely. And so that's a dangerous place for us to be as a nation right now. And the last
we have two opposing, really, mutually exclusive worldviews, two different countries living in America right now. And the great struggle ahead is, how that shakes out, whether it's through some sort of balkanization or outright, violent conflict, which we may be seeing the beginning of now. That's a scary road to even go down, but there is some precedent for that as well in our history, isn't there?
There is. And so the last time we saw those types of things really come to the fore, of course, was in the 1860s when our nation was fighting a civil war over the course of our country, who we would be. And I think that there are remarkable similarities right now to that period of time. And that's why we're on such a dangerous precipice right now. Yeah. We're in a very, very unstable situation. And the ideas that are being suggested by the radical left are the ideas that could propel us into that kind of separation. Yeah. And that separation will not be peaceful. It will be violent. And so these people are playing with fire. And there's a great amount that's at risk here. I think most Americans don't view it through that lens, but they need to start thinking along those lines. They need to look at these protests that are happening in places like Seattle and places like Portland, and they need to understand that this is not a conversation about racial justice. This is not a conversation about race relations. This is a conversation about whether or not we will continue to remain the United States of America, whether or not we will continue to remain a constitutional republic. Very much like in the 1960s, the agitators right now are using the conversation about race as a disguise, as camouflage for what their true intentions are. And they're bringing along all the people that Lenin would have called useful idiots to participate in this protest. They are using good people who in their heart really do want racial harmony in the United States, really want racial justice in the United States. And they're co-opting those people, and they're using them as agents of destruction right now. They're being used. And the true goals here have nothing to do with the conversation about race in America. It's about whether or not we will have a constitutional republic that believes in traditional American values, or if we will replace that with a socialist system.
And folks, I think what that tells us is that even if there was a question of systemic racism in America, which I don't believe there is, I don't believe America is a systemically racist country, but even if there was, and we fixed it through this time, that would not solve the problem that we're seeing now, because that is not the objective of the people who are pushing this violence that we're seeing across the country. And so don't let yourself get caught up in the idea that if I just learn to be more compassionate towards people of the other race, that all of this will go away. It won't. if I just vote for people who claim to be the ones who are the most compassionate, all of this will stop. It won't. What the people who are pushing this violence want is to literally remake this country into Venezuela, into Russia, into a communist China. They have totally radical designs on America, and they always have. And they are hiding behind the concept of racial justice in order to push that agenda. Just like when I was in Portland, you had these Black Lives Matter protesters up front and the Antifa guys in the back who were lobbing fire bombs at the police, using the Black Lives Matter protesters as human shields. That's exactly what's happening in a philosophical and ideological sense here in America today. These two worldviews cannot coexist. And the people who believe that America is worth defending, that America as an idea of a united people, e pluribus unum, is worth saving, need to stand up and need to vote. All right, folks, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you, Mike, for coming on with us. Very insightful and incisive commentary from you, as always. I really appreciate having you on.
Thanks, Chuck. I wish we were in a different position in America right now, but we're not, and we have to face that reality. I pray for our nation. I pray for all of our citizens, and I hope that we'll come through this stronger and better on the other side.
And that is the first and best thing we can do for America right now, is to pray for her. So let's do that. All right. Thank you very much. We'll see you again on next time on the Hot Zone next week. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you.
Thank you.
All right, let me hit stop.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.